Have you ever found yourself in a situation where you were stripped of absolutely everything by your own husband, only to be handed a wedding invitation to his marriage with another woman? I once thought that divorce was the final period at the end of a misguided marriage, but no. The day I walked out of the courthouse, empty-handed and broken-hearted, the man I had dedicated my entire youth to loving smiled and tossed a gold-embossed invitation right in my face. On it was his name, alongside the name of the woman who had wedged herself into my life for the past 2 years, and the $3.5 million mansion I once called my sanctuary. It was now solely under his name. I thought I had lost it all. That is, until my father looked at me and said exactly one sentence: "Don't cry. Just go to the reception. There will be a great show." At the time, I didn't understand, but after that night, I realized that some falls are not the end, but the prelude to a reckoning that makes the betrayer regret their choices for the rest of their life. That afternoon, the Chicago sky was a heavy charcoal gray, as if someone had draped a blanket of smog over the city, casting a melancholic shadow over everything. The rain wasn't heavy, just a persistent drizzle, but it was enough to make the pavement outside the Daly Center courthouse slick and freezing cold. Lines of cars glided past, their headlights bleeding into blurred streaks on the wet asphalt, perfectly mirroring my state of mind, tangled, exhausted, and so utterly hollow that I could no longer feel anything clearly. I stood silently under the awning of the courthouse, still clutching the freshly signed divorce papers in my hand. The thin sheets of paper felt like a razor-sharp blade, severing 11 years of my youth with just a few strokes of cold, black ink. The chilling wind ruffled my coat, but my body felt as stiff as a stone statue. 11 years. 11 years of loving a man, trusting a man, living for a man. Only to walk out of this building today with nothing but the clothes on my back. No house, no husband, no place I could call a family. I let out a laugh, a dry, hollow sound that even I found unrecognizable. Right at that moment, a short honk pierced the air in front of me. I looked up. A sleek, black Mercedes, one I knew all too well, pulled up right in front of the gates, glossy and cold. The door opened, and Gregory stepped out. He looked the same as always, a crisp, white dress shirt, an expensive Rolex on his wrist, his hair perfectly styled, and the handsome face I had once been so immensely proud of. But today, all of those things only made me feel nauseated. Beside him, a woman stepped out of the passenger side. She wore a form-fitting cream dress that hugged her slender figure. Her makeup was subtle but sharp, her soft, curled hair cascading over her shoulders. Her red lips curved into a smile, the smile of a victor. Ashley. The woman who had been sleeping with my husband behind my back for 2 years. They stood next to each other, looking like the picture-perfect couple, and I stood there under the damp awning, feeling like an obsolete extra in my own life story. I turned to walk away, but his voice drifted over light as the breeze, but sharp as a knife. "Maya." I froze. I didn't understand why just hearing that familiar call made my heart ache, even though my logic was screaming that this man was no longer worth it. I turned back and looked him dead in the eye. "Is there something else? Or do you feel you haven't done enough?" Greg wasn't angry. He merely smirked, a shallow, tasteless smile, as if everything that had just transpired was nothing more than routine business. He stepped closer, as composed as if he were meeting a client. I thought we should tie up loose ends properly. Saying that, he reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a crimson envelope. It was a glaring, brilliant red that looked completely out of place against the dreary gray backdrop of the rainy afternoon. He held it out to me. "A gift for you." I stared at the envelope. My heart pounded against my ribs like someone was taking a hammer to my chest. "What is this?" "Open it." I didn't want to touch it. Every instinct inside me screamed that the contents would hurt more than anything I had endured so far. But my hand reached out anyway. I opened it. It was a wedding invitation. Thick cardstock, gold foil lettering, perfectly elegant. And right in the center, 2 names stood out prominently: Gregory Vance and Ashley Palmer. My ears started ringing. All the ambient sounds, the falling rain, the passing cars, the chatter of pedestrians seemed to be pulled miles away, morphing into a muffled blur as if I were standing underwater. I looked up. Greg was watching me, his eyes terrifyingly calm and cruel. "It's in 10 days. Come, celebrate with us." Behind him, Ashley took a delicate step forward, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "Please don't be too sad, Maya. You can never predict matters of the heart. Greg and I, it's just destiny." Destiny! Those two words felt like a slap across the face. I glared at her, forcing the words out of my constricted throat. "You call wedging yourself into someone else's marriage destiny?" The smile on Ashley's lips stiffened for a fraction of a second, but she quickly recovered her fake, gentle demeanor. "You can think whatever you want, but the one staying with Greg is me." I gripped the invitation so tightly the edges bit into my palm. Greg finally spoke up, his tone dripping with mockery. "Maya, you need to accept reality. You lost." Lost. I let out a trembling laugh. "You cheat on me, you trick me into signing away my rights, you siphon off all our assets, and you tell me I lost?" He shrugged casually. "In this life, the smartest one wins. You were just too trusting." I stared at him. The man I had loved blindly. The man I thought I would hold hands with until the end of my days. It turned out he was nothing more than a cold, calculating machine. Someone who had planned everything from the very beginning, from the affair, to the asset transfers, to this exact moment, standing before me handing out a wedding invitation as the final, crushing blow. I didn't say another word. I hurled the invitation hard against his chest. "Keep it. Invite someone who cares." But Greg didn't get angry. He calmly bent down, picked it up, brushed it off, and shoved it back into my hand. His eyes turned ice cold. "Take it. You should come." I trembled, not out of weakness, but out of sheer, suffocating rage. Right at that moment, my phone vibrated. The screen lit up with one word: Dad. I turned my back, walked quickly to my car, and slammed the door shut. And for the first time in days, I broke down. I cried until I couldn't breathe. "Why? Why is this happening to me?" I mumbled, tears streaming uncontrollably. I picked up the phone. "Dad," my voice cracked. "I'm done. I lost everything." The other end of the line was silent for a few seconds. Then, my father's voice came through. It wasn't loud, it wasn't panicked, but it was as solid as steel. "Do not cry." I choked on a sob. "Dad, he took the house. And he just handed me a wedding invitation." A heavy silence followed. Then, my father asked, "What time?" "Saturday evening." "Next week." "Good." I didn't understand. "Dad?" His voice dropped lower, every word articulated with absolute clarity. "You are going to that reception." I froze. "What did you just say?" He only added one more sentence, a sentence that altered the course of everything that followed. "There is going to be a great show." I sat in dead silence, tears still wet on my cheeks, but inside me, for the very first time, something began to shift. That night, I couldn't sleep. The small, dingy apartment I had hastily rented was on the 3rd floor of an old building on the outskirts of the city. The pale yellow light of a street lamp cast long, peeling shadows on the wall. The rain pattered against the metal balcony roof. Every drop sounded heartbreakingly sad. I sat hugging my knees on the bed, my hand still clutching the crumpled wedding invitation. 10 days. In just 10 days, the man I once called my husband would put on a tuxedo, stand in front of a crowd, hold another woman's hand, and walk down the aisle. And me? I had absolutely nothing left. No house, no title, not even a true place to return to. I laughed out loud, and fresh tears fell. But right then, my father's words echoed in my mind. "Don't cry. There is going to be a great show." A great show. I closed my eyes. My father, Robert, was never a man to speak empty words. His entire life, he had been the kind of man whose silence was his most terrifying trait. To outsiders, he was just a quiet, unassuming, middle-aged man. But anyone who had ever done business with him in the Chicago real estate market knew that once Robert Sterling made a move, no one had time to react. But this wasn't a business deal. This was his daughter. The next morning, I drove to my father's house. It was an older, modest brick bungalow, tucked away in a quiet neighborhood, a stark contrast to the luxurious $3.5 million North Shore mansion I had just been evicted from. But stepping inside, I realized that this was what a real home felt like. My dad was sitting on the porch, drinking black coffee. The morning sun slanted through the oak trees, casting dappled light onto the stone table in front of him. He wore a faded flannel shirt, holding his mug with a perfectly calm expression, as if the world wasn't collapsing around me. As soon as I walked up, he merely glanced at me. He didn't ask how I was, didn't offer a pitying hug. He just said, "Have you eaten breakfast?" I stood there, and the tears naturally welled up again. "Dad," he set his mug down. "Sit." I sat across from him, my hands shaking so badly I didn't know where to begin. My dad looked at me for a long time before speaking slowly. "Have you cried enough?" I bit my lip. Crying won't get anything back. I stayed silent. True, crying solves nothing. My dad pushed a thick manila folder across the table toward me. "Look at this." I wiped my eyes and opened it. On the very first page, I froze. It was the closing documents and deed records for the $3.5 million mansion. "Dad, what is this?" My dad took a sip of his coffee, his tone perfectly even. "Did you really think that house belonged entirely to Greg?" I shot up, "Didn't it?" "The deed is fully in his name." My dad let out a faint smirk, the exact smirk I had seen whenever someone was about to fall into one of his corporate traps. "You are still too naive." My heart hammered against my ribs. "What do you mean?" He didn't answer immediately. He reached over, flipped through a few pages of the dossier, and pointed to a specific document. "Read this clause carefully." I leaned in. It was a mezzanine loan and equity agreement addendum, but there was one line that made my blood run cold. Supplemental capital financing provided via private holding entity overseen by Robert Sterling. I looked up, my eyes wide. "Dad, this was your money." I could barely breathe. But I thought you just gave it to us as a wedding gift." He looked at me, his eyes turning razor sharp. "I gave it to you so you could live comfortably. That does not mean I gave anyone permission to steal it." I started shaking. "So that means—" My dad leaned forward, his voice dropping into a dangerous baritone. "That mansion was never completely his." An electric shock ran down my spine. "But the deed, the paperwork, is what the courts see." He tapped his finger lightly on the table. "Paperwork is just what people see. The thing that dictates the outcome is what's hidden behind the paperwork." I started to understand, though I still couldn't fully believe it. "Dad, what are you going to do?" He looked straight at me, and his eyes were no longer those of a regular father. They were the eyes of a chess master who had already set up his checkmate. "You are going to attend that wedding." My chest tightened. "And then what?" He smirked. "A good show needs to be performed in front of a large audience." I swallowed hard. "Dad, how long have you been preparing this?" He didn't answer. He only said a sentence that sent a chill down my spine. "Since the very first day you brought him home." I was stunned. "Dad, you knew he would do this?" "I didn't know." He shook his head. "But I know that his kind of character eventually shows its true colors." A heavy silence enveloped the porch. I looked at the man sitting across from me. For the first time in my life, I felt incredibly lucky to be his daughter. That afternoon, as I left my father's house, the rain had completely stopped. The sky was a bit clearer, and my mindset was entirely different. I was no longer a betrayed, destitute woman. I was simply waiting. Waiting for the wedding day. Waiting for the moment the tables would turn. Somewhere else in the city, Greg was likely busy preparing for his dream wedding. He had no idea, and neither did Ashley, that the wedding invitation he had so arrogantly thrown in my face would serve as his VIP ticket to a nightmare he would never forget. That night, the $3.5 million mansion was brilliantly illuminated. Warm, golden light spilled from the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, reflecting off the decorative pond in the front yard, shimmering like a desperately desired illusion of luxury. In the grand living room, the old sofas had been replaced with brighter, trendier European imports, and the heavy drapes were swapped for expensive imported silk. Everything bore a new signature. The signature of the other woman. Ashley stood in the center of the living room, doing a slow twirl, a thoroughly satisfied smile on her lips. It's gorgeous. A completely different class from my old condo. She walked over, ran her hand along the edge of the marble island, and surveyed the house like she was inspecting a newly purchased handbag. See? I told you. I just needed to tweak a few things, and it looks brand new. Greg stood behind her, hands in his pockets. His gaze also swept across the familiar space, which now carried a completely different vibe. There were no traces of me left. None of the decor I had meticulously chosen. Nothing of the past. He smirked. Yeah. Now it finally feels like our house. Ashley turned around and smiled sweetly. I told you. Everything that belonged to her, I'm replacing. A light, airy sentence, but it acted as a butcher's knife, carving out every memory that had ever existed in this home. Greg stepped forward, wrapping his arms around her waist from behind. No rush. We can renovate the whole place after the wedding. Ashley leaned her head on his shoulder, pouting slightly. I just wanted to erase every trace of her as fast as possible. Looking at her stuff just annoyed me. Greg laughed. Don't worry. From now on, you're the only one here. Outside, the wind began to pick up. The oak trees in the yard swayed, their leaves rustling aggressively against each other. The temperature suddenly dropped, even though the central heating was on. Ashley shivered slightly. Do you feel a draft? It's just your imagination. Greg let go of her and walked over to the wet bar, pouring 2 glasses of scotch. Have a drink. Today is our first official night moving into our new home. Ashley took the glass, but her eyes subconsciously darted toward the front door. For some reason, she felt an unsettling chill, as if the house itself was rejecting her presence. Around 10:30 p.m., just as they sat down on the sofa, a sharp knock, knock, knock echoed through the house. They both jumped. Ashley slammed her glass down on the table. Who is here at this hour? Greg frowned. I don't know. The knocking resumed. Slow, rhythmic, not rushed, but chilling enough to send a shiver down their spines. Knock, knock, knock. Greg stood up. Let me go see. Ashley grabbed his arm. Wait. I have a bad feeling about this. It's late. Maybe it's just the private security? Greg gently peeled her hand off and walked toward the foyer. The massive custom wood door swung open. Outside stood a man in his late 50s. He wore a dark, tailored suit and carried a leather briefcase. His face was entirely neutral, but his eyes were razor-sharp. Who are you? Greg asked, irritation lacing his voice. The man didn't answer immediately. He looked straight at Greg and spoke slowly. I am the owner of this house. Greg scowled. Excuse me? What do you want? The man gave a curt nod. Good. He opened his briefcase and pulled out a stack of legal documents. Then we need to have a little chat. Greg's irritation peaked. It's late. This is highly inappropriate. If you have business, come back, Tom. This matter, the man interrupted sharply, concerns the legal ownership and equity rights of this estate. The atmosphere instantly froze. Ashley, who had walked up behind Greg, felt her heart pound. What did you just say? The man handed the documents forward. Take a look. Greg snatched the files. Within seconds, the color drained from his face. His expression shifted from annoyance to shock to a sickly, pale dread. What is this? His voice cracked. The man replied calmly. Documentation confirming the financial obligations, liens, and equity rights pertaining to the initial capital investment of this property. Ashley stepped forward and yanked the papers from Greg's hands. Let me see that. She quickly flipped through the pages, her eyes widening as she stopped at a specific addendum. Impossible. Right here, a name is clearly printed. Robert Sterling. The man standing before them spoke slowly. I assume you two should be aware that this house is not as legally straightforward as you thought. Greg gripped the edge of the doorframe. Who the hell are you? The man looked him dead in the eye, his voice deep and authoritative. Arthur Thompson, legal counsel representing Mr. Robert Sterling. A wave of ice crashed over Greg. Ashley stumbled back a step. No, that's impossible. The deed is in Greg's name. The lawyer offered a faint, chilling smile. Having a name on a deed does not equate to unencumbered ownership when there are outstanding mezzanine loans and equity liens. He snapped his briefcase shut. We will be serving official notice of litigation shortly. Before he turned to leave, he paused for a fraction of a second and added, "Oh, by the way." He looked straight at Greg. "I imagine your wedding is going to be quite the event." The heavy door closed. The space fell into a terrifying silence. Greg stood paralyzed in the grand foyer. Ashley was shaking. "Greg, what does this mean?" Greg didn't answer, because for the very first time, he realized that everything he thought he controlled was slipping right through his fingers. Somewhere else, I sat in my small apartment, looking out the window. My phone vibrated. A text message from my dad. "The curtain has opened." I gripped the phone tightly, my heart racing, and for the first time in a very long time, I smiled. The next morning, the $3.5 million mansion was no longer the peaceful sanctuary it had been the night before. The air was so thick and heavy that every footstep seemed to echo menacingly. Greg sat alone in the living room, staring at the stack of documents the lawyer had left behind. The morning sun streamed through the expansive windows, but it did nothing to warm the room. He had read the files 3 times over, and with every read, his hands grew colder. "Impossible," he muttered to himself. "This can't be happening." The bedroom door upstairs opened, and Ashley practically ran down the stairs, her face still pale. "Greg, I didn't sleep a wink last night." He didn't respond. He just stared at the papers as if trying to burn a hole through them. She stepped closer, her voice frantic. "Say something. Who was that lawyer? Why is her father's name on these documents?" Greg slammed his fist onto the coffee table. "I'm trying to figure it out," he barked, startling her. She bit her lip, too afraid to push further. A long moment passed. Greg suddenly jumped up, grabbed his phone, and dialed. "Mark, I need to see you immediately. It's an emergency." The voice on the other end muttered a brief acknowledgement. Greg hung up and turned to Ashley. "I'm going to see my lawyer. You come with me." "No," he snapped. "Stay here." The door slammed shut. Ashley stood alone in the center of the massive living room. For the first time, she no longer found the house beautiful. She only felt cold. The upscale cafe where Greg met his lawyer was located on a high floor overlooking the Chicago skyline. But today, Greg had absolutely no interest in the view. "I reviewed it, Mark," Greg's personal attorney said as he set the file down. He did not look pleased. Greg stared at him. "Give it to me straight. How bad is it?" Mark let out a heavy sigh. "Very bad." Greg's heart hammered against his ribs. "How bad?" Mark pushed his glasses up the bridge of his nose, his voice dropping low. "If these documents are authenticated in court, that mansion is not your separate property." Greg scoffed bitterly. "Are you kidding me? The deed is in my name." "Correct," Mark nodded, but he tapped his finger on the table. "However, there is a massive capital injection from a holding company owned by Robert Sterling, your ex-father-in-law. And that capital injection was structured as a mezzanine loan with an equity conversion clause. It wasn't a gift." Greg was dead silent. A memory flashed through his mind. The times Maya had handed him stacks of paperwork to sign. The times he rushed through the procedures, assuming everything was under his control. Now, all of it was snapping back like a steel trap. Greg clenched his jaw. "So, am I losing the house?" Mark didn't answer immediately. He just said, "If opposing counsel pushes this aggressively, you won't just lose the house." Greg's head snapped up. "What else? You could face a prolonged, grueling lawsuit. And if they prove that you intentionally engaged in fraudulent conveyance transferring assets during the marriage with malicious intent to hide them." Mark paused. "Then you are in massive legal jeopardy. Criminal jeopardy." The air felt like it had been sucked out of the room. Greg sat perfectly still, a cold sweat breaking out across his back. That afternoon, Greg returned to the mansion. Ashley immediately ran up to him. "How did it go?" Greg tossed the file onto the table. "It's a disaster." "What kind of disaster?" He didn't answer right away. He paced the room, finally stopping in front of the large glass window. "We might not be able to keep this house." It was as if Ashley had been struck by lightning. "What?" "Shut up," Greg yelled. She recoiled, her eyes turning red. "What do you mean we can't keep it? This is our house." Greg spun around, his eyes blazing with frustration. Do you think it's that simple? Maya's father set this up years ago. Ashley shook her head in panic. No, no, no. I already told my friends, my family, that after the wedding we were moving in here. Greg closed his eyes, desperately trying to maintain his composure. It's not a sure thing yet, but what if we do lose it? Ashley practically screamed. How are you going to provide for me? You promised me. The tension in the room snapped like a tightrope. Greg glared at her, and for the first time, his gaze held no affection, only extreme annoyance. Stop being so dramatic. Those words made Ashley freeze completely. What? What did you just say? I said calm down, Greg growled. Nothing is set in stone yet. Ashley let out a bitter, cynical laugh, tears spilling over her cheeks. Wow. Unbelievable. When you needed me, you said you loved me. Now that there's trouble, I'm being dramatic. Greg turned away, refusing to argue. But in that exact moment, the very first crack appeared in their foundation. 3 days later, most of the wedding invitations had been sent out. The 5-star hotel was booked, the floral arrangements finalized, and the guest list was packed with Chicago's elite. Everything was proceeding exactly according to plan. But only Greg knew that the ground beneath him was crumbling. The night before the wedding, Greg stood alone in his home office, staring out at the city lights. His phone buzzed. An unknown number. Just one line of text. Don't think you can keep it all. Greg gripped the phone. Who is this? There was no reply. Elsewhere, I sat in front of the mirror, trying on the simple black dress my father had bought for me. It wasn't an evening gown. It wasn't flashy. But it was formal enough. I looked at my reflection. I was no longer the weak, broken woman from a few days ago. My phone lit up. A text from my dad. Tomorrow, just stand and watch. I smiled. For the first time, I was actually looking forward to that wedding. Saturday evening. The Peninsula Hotel was radiating light like a royal palace. Crystal chandeliers hung high above, casting a golden glow over the grand ballroom. The tables were flawlessly set, imported white roses arranged in massive centerpieces, and a plush red carpet led straight to the main stage. The guests arrived in droves. Corporate executives, business partners, wealthy friends, everyone was dressed in haute couture, holding champagne flutes and laughing boisterously. I heard the groom is incredibly successful, a multi-million-dollar estate in the North Shore. The bride is gorgeous too, a perfect match. Compliments floated through the air. No one had any idea that tonight was not going to be an ordinary wedding. In the bridal suite, Ashley stood in front of the full-length mirror, wearing a pristine white designer wedding gown. It was encrusted with Swarovski crystals, from the shoulders to the train, her hair styled in an elaborate updo, her makeup flawless. She smiled. Finally. The day has come. The makeup artist standing behind her gushed, "You look stunning, Ashley, like a princess." Ashley tilted her head slightly, her eyes brimming with satisfaction. Of course, this is the day I step into my new life. A new life that she had schemed, calculated, and fought for over 2 years. A life she fully believed she had won. In another suite, Greg adjusted his silk tie in the mirror. His expensive tuxedo hugged his frame perfectly, his face as handsome as ever. But his eyes lacked their usual confidence. Beneath his composed exterior, a fire of anxiety was smoldering. He remembered the anonymous text from last night. Don't think you can keep it all. He clenched his fists. It's fine. It's just a bluff, he reassured himself. Once the wedding is over, I'll handle the lawyers. But deep down, the feeling of dread refused to fade. I stepped into the grand ballroom. The simple black dress hugged my figure. It wasn't overly striking, but it made me look entirely different from the fragile woman I was before. My eyes were calm. No more pain. No more panic. Just waiting. A few people recognized me. The whispers started immediately. Is that the ex-wife? Why is she here? She's got some nerve. I didn't care. I walked straight in. In a quiet corner of the ballroom, my father was already seated. He wore a simple, dark suit, but his aura commanded absolute authority. In front of him was a cup of hot tea, not champagne. He looked at me and gave a slight nod. He didn't say a word. But I understood. It was time. The wedding march began to play. The grand double doors opened, and Greg stood on the stage, wearing his picture-perfect smile. Ashley slowly walked down the aisle, clutching her bouquet, her glamorous white train gliding behind her. The guests applauded, the music swelled, and the room was filled with a facade of overwhelming happiness. They stood facing each other. The officiant began to speak. "We have reached the sacred moment where the bride and groom will exchange rings." Greg picked up the diamond ring. Ashley extended her hand, her eyes sparkling. Just a few more seconds, and it would all be official. And right at that moment, "Stop." A voice echoed from the back of the ballroom. It wasn't shouting, but it was loud enough to bring the entire venue to a dead halt. Everyone turned around. A group of men in sharp suits walked through the doors. Leading them was the lawyer from the other night. The atmosphere shifted instantly. Greg froze. Ashley turned pale. "What? What is going on?" The lawyer stepped forward, his voice projecting clearly. "Apologies for the interruption, but we have an urgent legal notice to serve." The MC was flustered. "Who are you?" "This is a wedding ceremony. We are legal representation," the lawyer stated, holding up a file, "regarding the assets currently held under the name of Mr. Gregory Vance." The ballroom erupted into chaotic whispers. Greg lunged forward, his voice a harsh hiss. "What the hell are you doing? This is my wedding." The lawyer looked him dead in the eye. "Which is exactly why we chose this moment." Ashley panicked. "Greg, what is happening?" The lawyer opened the file. His voice echoed, every word dropping like ice, freezing the room. "The $3.5 million North Shore estate is currently under active litigation. And per the injunction filed by Mr. Robert Sterling," he paused for a fraction of a second, "we are executing an immediate freeze on all associated assets." The ballroom exploded. "What? Asset freeze? What kind of wedding is this?" Greg stood paralyzed. No, you can't do this." Ashley was trembling. "Say something, do something." The lawyer wasn't finished. "Furthermore," he turned the page, "you have submitted evidentiary filings to the court regarding the fraudulent concealment and illegal transfer of marital assets during the divorce proceedings." Greg's face turned the color of ash. You are slandering me." The lawyer didn't smile. He merely said, "We have full evidentiary backing." The air in the room was suffocating, and right at that moment, a deep, resonant voice echoed from the back of the crowd. "I am the evidence." Everyone spun around. My father stood up. Step by step, he walked toward the stage, his eyes as cold as a glacier. Greg looked at him like he was staring at the Grim Reaper. My father stopped right in front of him. He didn't slap him. He didn't yell. He just asked one single question. "Is the show entertaining enough for you?" The entire ballroom was dead silent. I stood in the back, watching it all unfold, and for the very first time, I saw the scales of justice begin to tip. The air inside the ballroom felt as though it had been flash frozen. Hundreds of eyes were glued to the stage. The romantic music had died out. The cheerful laughter was gone, leaving only a suffocating, unbearable tension. Greg stood there, the wedding ring still pinched between his fingers, his face completely drained of blood. "Robert, there. There must be some misunderstanding." He tried to keep his voice steady, but the tremor in his syllables betrayed him. My father looked at him, his eyes devoid of anger, holding only pure, unadulterated contempt. "A misunderstanding?" He let out a dry, cynical laugh. "Do you honestly think I lived this long just to let a punk like you pull the wool over my eyes?" The words dropped like a sledgehammer. The crowd murmured in shock. Ashley stood beside Greg, her hands clutching the luxurious fabric of her gown. "Mr. Sterling." What do you mean by this?" Her voice had noticeably shrunk, entirely stripped of the arrogant confidence she had when she walked down the aisle. My father didn't even dignify her with a glance. He turned to the lawyer. "Show them." The lawyer nodded. He opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of documents. Then, out of nowhere, the massive LED screens behind the stage flared to life. The entire room jumped. Flashed across the screens were a rapid succession of images. Wire transfer receipts, offshore shell company documents, hidden LLC registrations, and text message screenshots. And then, an audio recording began to play. The acoustics of the ballroom amplified it so every single person could hear it perfectly. It was Greg's voice, unmistakable and clear. Just keep funneling the assets into the holding account. Once she signs the papers, she'll walk away with absolutely nothing. The ballroom erupted into absolute chaos. Oh my God, that's vile. He planned the whole thing. He robbed his own wife. Greg screamed, "Turn that off! Stop it!" But it was too late. Another recording immediately followed. This time, it was Ashley's voice. "Just be patient for a little longer, babe. As soon as she signs away her rights, we'll get married right away." Ashley froze, her jaw dropping in horror. No, that's not. She stumbled backward, the heel of her shoe catching on her heavy train, nearly sending her crashing to the floor. The guests were practically shouting now. She really is the mistress. What an incredible performance. They deserve each other. I've never seen a wedding blow up like this. Greg lunged toward the lawyer. "Where did you get these? This is illegal." The lawyer remained perfectly composed, stepping back smoothly. "We are simply presenting exhibits that have already been filed with the federal court." My father finally spoke again. His voice was deep, and every word nailed itself into the minds of everyone present. "The things you thought were brilliant secrets, I have known about for a very long time." Greg whipped around to face him. You had me followed?" My dad shook his head slowly. "I only observed. You thought you were a genius, Greg, but you forgot who you were dealing with." The silence that followed was terrifying. Ashley was on the verge of a full panic attack. "Greg, say something. Tell them this is fake. Tell them." Greg couldn't answer. He knew perfectly well that every single document, every single recording, was authentic. He was completely cornered. The lawyer flipped to the final page in his binder. "We have one final public declaration." The room held its breath. "Based on the totality of the evidence and the emergency injunction granted by the judge, we are officially executing the immediate repossession and lockout of the North Shore estate." Ashley shrieked, "No!" Simultaneously, the lawyer continued. "Furthermore, we are initiating a civil lawsuit and referring this case to the district attorney for criminal fraud and malicious concealment of marital assets." Greg stood paralyzed as if he had been struck by lightning. The diamond ring slipped from his fingers, hitting the polished stage floor. Clink, clink. The tiny sound echoed through the massive, silent room like the final toll of a death knell. Guests began standing up. Some were shaking their heads in disgust, some were recording on their phones, others were whispering frantically to each other. The fairy tale wedding had officially morphed into a grotesque circus act. Ashley looked around, her eyes wild and frantic. No, I won't accept this. I can't lose everything like this." She grabbed Greg's lapels, shaking him. "Say something. You promised me." Greg looked like a hollowed-out shell. His entire world had collapsed in the span of 5 minutes. "Shut up," he roared. "Why should I shut up?" Ashley screamed back, tears ruining her flawless makeup. "You dragged me into this. You told me that house was yours. You told me it was all handled." Greg shoved her away, his eyes filled with venomous rage. "Oh, like you're so innocent? If you hadn't constantly pressured me, do you think I would have rushed the transfers and made mistakes? You're blaming me? You think you're the victim here." The two of them began screaming at each other. Right there on the stage, in front of hundreds of Chicago's elite, the sparkling white wedding gown suddenly looked incredibly pathetic. The grand romance they had flaunted was exposed as nothing more than a cheap, transactional transaction. I stood in the back of the room, watching it all unfold in silence. I felt no joy. I felt no vindictive thrill. I just felt calm. My father turned around and looked at me. His eyes softened slightly. Without a word, I understood. It was over. Before walking away, my father paused for one final moment. He looked back at Greg, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. "Remember this. The price of underestimating people is always higher than you can afford to pay." He turned and walked down the aisle. I followed right behind him. The chaotic shouting on the stage continued to echo through the ballroom. but I never looked back. Because this time, I wasn't the one being left behind. I didn't turn my head even once. The heavy doors of the hotel swung shut behind me, cutting off the noise and the chaos. Outside, the cool Chicago night wind brushed against my face, carrying a refreshing chill, a sensation I hadn't truly felt in what seemed like an eternity. I stood still for a few seconds, taking a deep, long breath. My chest no longer felt heavy. The suffocating, crushing weight that had plagued me for the past few weeks had vanished. My father stood beside me, his hands clasped behind his back, staring straight out at the city lights. "How do you feel?" he asked. I gave a faint smile. "Tired, but incredibly light." He nodded. "Good. That's what matters." We didn't say anything else to each other, but for the first time in a very long time, I felt profoundly protected. 3 days later, the news of the disastrous wedding had spread everywhere. It didn't even require news outlets. The videos recorded by the guests were enough to make the story the most talked-about scandal in the city's corporate circles. The groom exposed on stage, the mistress's true colors revealed, the $3.5 million mansion seized by the courts. Everyone who heard it shook their heads. Everyone who watched the clips gossiped relentlessly. Greg's name was no longer synonymous with successful entrepreneur. It was permanently attached to one word: fraud. His company immediately began to suffer the fallout. Investors pulled their funding. Major contracts were canceled overnight. The people who had praised and flattered him just a week prior either went completely silent or actively turned their backs on him. One morning, he walked into his office building. The staff no longer greeted him with respect. Instead, they actively avoided eye contact, whispering as soon as he passed by. "Is that the boss? I heard he's getting indicted." Serves him right. Greg clenched his fists, but he couldn't do a damn thing, because he knew everything was slipping rapidly out of his control. As for Ashley, she had to move out of the North Shore estate just 2 days after the wedding. It wasn't voluntary. She was legally evicted. The house had been locked down, and everything inside was being inventoried by court-appointed auditors. She stood outside the massive iron gates, her designer suitcases piled on the driveway. Her face was stripped of every ounce of the haughty pride she possessed on her wedding day. That heavily beaded white gown was now nothing more than a humiliating memory. What are we supposed to do now?" she asked, her voice trembling. Greg stood perfectly still, staring at the pavement. He didn't answer. "Say something," she practically screamed. Greg turned to her, his eyes freezing cold. "Figure it out yourself. One sentence. Severing everything." Ashley stood paralyzed. You're dumping me?" Greg let out a harsh, bitter laugh. "Do you honestly think I have the resources to take care of anyone else right now?" She stumbled backward, tears streaming down her face. "You promised me. I gave up everything for you." Greg turned his back and walked toward his car without a single backward glance. In that exact moment, Ashley finally understood that what she thought was true love was nothing more than a transaction. And when she no longer held any value, she was discarded like trash. As for me, I started over. No loud declarations, no dramatic speeches, just one step at a time. My dad brought me back to the corporate firm I had helped build from the ground up years ago. But this time, I wasn't standing in the shadows supporting a husband. I was stepping into the executive role I deserved. "You make the calls now," my dad said. "From now on, you don't need to hide behind anyone." I looked at him and nodded. In the weeks that followed, I threw myself into my work. But it wasn't the blind, desperate effort of the past. It was precise, calculated, and clear-headed. I audited our old client lists and personally reached out to every major partner. The people who had worked with me in the past still trusted me because they knew who the real brains behind the operation had always been. In just 2 weeks, I secured 3 massive contracts. The firm was operating at full capacity again. No Greg necessary, no one else necessary. One afternoon, I sat in my new corner office. The sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting a warm glow over my mahogany desk. I looked out at the Chicago skyline. The sky was a brilliant, clear blue, completely different from the gloomy, oppressive gray on the day I walked out of the courthouse. My phone vibrated. A text message from an unsaved number. Maya, can I please see you? I stared at the screen. I didn't even need to guess who it was. I didn't reply. I simply deleted the message and set the phone face down on my desk. Smoothly, decisively. That evening, I went to my dad's house. He was sitting on the porch, drinking his tea, just like he always did. I sat down across from him. Are you okay? He asked. I smiled. I'm great. He nodded, not needing to ask anything else, but his eyes were much softer now. I looked up at the night sky, a fleeting thought crossing my mind. If I hadn't picked up that wedding invitation that day, if I hadn't gone to the reception, if my dad hadn't said what he said, maybe I would still be that pathetic woman crying in her car. But I am not that woman anymore. Some losses are not the end of the world. They are just the universe's brutal way of forcing you to wake up. 3 weeks after the night, the entire city gossiped about a wedding that devolved into a spectacular circus. My life had gradually returned to a steady orbit. But it was not the same orbit as before. There were no more rushed mornings preparing breakfast for someone else. No more late dinners waiting for a man who was never going to come home on time. No more living with the constant anxiety, suspicion, and the exhausting mental gymnastics of convincing myself that everything was fine. I woke up every morning entirely for myself. And for the first time in a very long time, I felt incredibly light. That morning, the sunlight filtered through the sheer blinds of my executive office, casting a warm, golden glow across my desk. The space was quiet, save for the rhythmic clicking of my keyboard and the soft rustle of documents. I was reviewing a major new contract for a massive development project, a project where I used to just be the silent, supportive shadow in the background. Now, I was the one making the final call. There was a soft knock on the glass door. "Miss Sterling," my receptionist said, peeking her head in. "There's someone here to see you." I didn't look up from the contract immediately. "Who is it?" A brief hesitation. "He said his name is Gregory Vance." The pen in my hand stopped moving. Not out of pain, not out of shock. It was a very bizarre sensation, like hearing the name of a stranger you used to know a long time ago. I took a soft breath and said, "Send him in." The heavy glass door opened, and Greg walked in. But the man standing before me was no longer the man I had loved. He lacked the immaculate grooming, the designer suit, the effortless, arrogant charisma. His button-down shirt was severely wrinkled, the collar slightly askew. His hair was unkempt, and his eyes were hollowed out with deep, dark bags, as if he hadn't slept in weeks. He stood there, not daring to step further into the office, not daring to sit down. He just looked at me. "Maya." His voice was gravelly and weak. I looked up, meeting his eyes with absolute, unrippled calm. "Can I help you?" A simple question, but it was enough to make him freeze. He realized in that instant that I was no longer looking at him the way I used to. There was no warmth, no anticipation, no lingering affection, only distance. He swallowed hard. I wanted to talk to you." I gave a slight nod. "You're talking right now." He stood perfectly still for a few seconds, as if trying to gather every ounce of courage he had left. Finally, he spoke. "I lost everything." I didn't react. He offered a twisted, pathetic smile. "The company is basically bankrupt. The investors pulled out. The house is gone." He looked down at his trembling hands. "I have absolutely nothing left." I remained silent, not out of cruelty, but because I truly felt no pain for him. He looked up, his eyes flashing with genuine, raw vulnerability for the first time. "Maya." I messed up. The office was so quiet you could hear the hum of the HVAC system. I finally asked, "What do you want?" That question made him flinch. Perhaps he thought I would ask why he did it. But no, I no longer cared about the answer to that question. He took a step forward. "I want to come back." I stared at him for a long time. It was like looking at a fractured piece of my own past. Then, I let out a soft laugh. Not a laugh of joy, but a laugh acknowledging how absurdly far away all of this felt now. "Come back?" I repeated. "Do you remember the day you handed me that wedding invitation?" My voice was light, but every word sliced through the air like a scalpel. "You stood right in front of me and told me I should come celebrate your victory." He bowed his head, unable to meet my eyes. I stepped out from behind my desk and walked toward him, stopping when there was only 3 feet between us. I looked straight into his eyes. "Do you remember what else you said?" He remained silent. "You said," I continued. "You lost." A heavy pause hung in the room. I tilted my head slightly. "So, why are you crawling back now?" He couldn't answer. He just stood there, completely exposed and stripped bare. I let out a slow exhale, my voice dropping lower. "You didn't lose everything because of me." I stared dead into his eyes. "You lost everything because of you." He squeezed his eyes shut, his entire body trembling. I turned my back, having absolutely no desire to look at him any longer. "Leave." My voice was quiet, but absolute. He stood there for a long time, looking as if he wanted to say something else, but ultimately, he said nothing. He turned and walked out. The door clicked shut. It didn't make a loud noise, but it sounded exactly like a heavy book slamming shut on a finished chapter. I stood still for a moment, looking out the floor-to-ceiling windows. The city of Chicago was still loud, the L train rumbling in the distance, millions of people going about their lives. The world does not stop spinning just because a marriage falls apart, and no one else is going to live my life for me. I smiled faintly. It's true some people try to come back, not because they still love you, but because they simply hit rock bottom and realize they couldn't find anyone better to exploit. But by the time they realize that, you are no longer the woman waiting for them. The door clicked shut. There was no dramatic slam, but inside me, it felt as though an iron vault had just been sealed shut forever. I stood still for a few seconds. I didn't cry. I didn't shake. I felt no regret. I just let out a very long, very deep exhale, so light that it even surprised me. In the past, I always thought that if the day ever came where Greg crawled back and said, "I was wrong," I would definitely feel pain, hesitation, or weakness. But no, the moment actually arrived, and I realized a profound truth. Love can run incredibly deep, but once it endures enough deliberate cruelty, it simply dies. Quietly and completely. I walked back to my desk, sat down in my leather chair, and reopened the massive commercial real estate contract I was reviewing. The numbers, the clauses, the bold text, everything was highly logical and grounded in reality, unlike love. No lies, no betrayals. Just right or wrong. I picked up my Mont Blanc pen and signed the document, a sharp, decisive signature, exactly like the way I had just closed the book on my past. That afternoon, I left the office earlier than usual, not because I was exhausted, but because I just wanted to go for a drive. I drove my car slowly down the familiar streets of the city. I drove past the upscale cafe where Greg and I used to sit for hours on Sunday mornings. I drove past the boutique where we bought our very first piece of furniture together. I drove past places that were once dripping with memories. But the strange thing was, it didn't hurt anymore. It just felt distant, like I was watching a movie about someone else's life. I parked near a small park bordering Lake Michigan. I stepped out of the car. The late afternoon wind off the lake was brisk, carrying the scent of fresh water and the golden hour sunlight. Children were running around the playground. Elderly couples sat on benches, chatting, and young professionals jogged along the path. Life was so stunningly ordinary, yet it made me feel incredibly anchored. I sat down on a wooden bench, taking in the scene. For the first time, I wasn't thinking about the past. I wasn't thinking about Greg. I wasn't thinking about what I had lost. I was only thinking about how I wanted to live the rest of my life. My phone vibrated. A text message, not from my ex, but from a major venture capital partner. The proposal today was flawless. Looking forward to a very long and prosperous partnership. I smiled a genuine, warm smile. That evening, when I arrived at my dad's house, he was sitting in his usual spot on the porch, a cup of Earl Grey tea steaming in front of him. He looked up at me. "He came to see you." I nodded. "Yeah. And?" I sat down across from him. I stayed quiet for a moment, then said, "I have absolutely nothing left to say to him." My dad looked at me, didn't say a word, but the look in his eyes was absolute confirmation. I had crossed to the other side. A moment later, he asked, "Are you angry?" I thought about it, then shook my head. No. And I'm not bitter either. I smiled faintly. He just doesn't matter anymore. My dad nodded. Then you truly understand. I looked at him. Understand what? He took a slow sip of his tea, his voice dropping into a comforting baritone. When people wrong you, that is a reflection of their character. But whether you allow their actions to dictate the rest of your life, that is entirely up to you. I sat in silence. That simple sentence felt like it unlocked a massive, heavy door in my mind. That night, lying in my own bed, I didn't scroll aimlessly on my phone. I didn't overthink. I just stared at the ceiling and realized something beautiful. I was no longer terrified of being alone. I used to believe that a woman needed a family, a husband, someone sleeping next to her to be considered whole. But now I understood what being whole actually meant. It meant not needing to depend on anyone else to feel complete. Somewhere else in the city, Greg was sitting alone in a dark, empty room. No voices, no lights, just suffocating shadows. He stared at his phone, no text messages, no one looking for him. For the first time in his life, he understood the exact agonizing isolation he had put me through. As for me, I closed my eyes and fell into a deep, uninterrupted sleep. No nightmares, no anxiety, just pure, unadulterated peace. Sometimes, a breakup doesn't require tears. It just requires one person to keep walking forward and never look back. After the day he came to my office, Greg never showed his face again. But that didn't mean the fallout stopped. On the contrary, the real avalanche was just beginning to gain momentum. 3 days later, the news hit the financial sector. Greg's primary development firm was officially under federal financial investigation. It was no longer just a rumor, no longer just a warning. It was a full-blown raid. Corporate accounts were audited. Subcontracts were scrutinized. The shady, offshore wire transfers he had orchestrated to hide assets were dragged directly into the harsh fluorescent light of federal scrutiny. Everything he thought he had executed with absolute, untraceable precision was now evidence in a grand jury indictment. Inside his former office, the atmosphere was toxic. Employees huddled in the break rooms, whispering nervously. I heard the feds are locking the doors by Friday. We probably aren't even getting our last paychecks. He deserves it. Arrogant prick. Greg walked into the bullpen. No one greeted him. No one stood up. There were only averted eyes and hushed murmurs as soon as his back was turned. He stood in the middle of the floor, and for the first time, he felt completely alienated in the very empire he thought he ruled. Right at that moment, the glass doors to his private office swung open. Ashley marched in. No warning, no knocking. Her face was completely stripped of the helpless, fragile demeanor she had put on during our encounter. She looked frantic and furious. "Greg," her voice cracked like a whip. "We need to talk." Greg scowled. "What are you doing here?" "I'm not here to ask you questions. I'm here to tell you what's going to happen." She marched straight up to his desk and slammed a manila folder down on the glass. "Look at it." Greg opened it. Within seconds, all the blood drained from his face. "This..." Ashley crossed her arms, her voice laced with ice. "The 6-figure wire transfers you sent to my accounts. You coded them as media consulting retainers. What about them?" She let out a cynical, humorless laugh. "Do you think the IRS and the FBI are stupid?" The tension in the room spiked instantly. Greg gripped the edges of the folder. "What do you want?" Ashley stared him down. No pouting, no fake affection. Just pure, unfiltered self-preservation. "I refuse to go down with your sinking ship." "So what?" "You need to fix it." "Fix it how?" Greg stepped closer, his voice dropping into a furious hiss. "Take the fall." She articulated every syllable flawlessly. "Sign a sworn affidavit stating I had no knowledge of the origin of those funds, so I don't get indicted." Greg let out a loud, bitter laugh. "Do you think I'm a moron?" Ashley shrugged indifferently. "If you don't take the fall, we both go to federal prison." The words hung in the air, cold as a steel blade. Greg looked at her, and for the very first time, he saw her with absolute clarity. This woman had never loved him. Not for a single second. Meanwhile, Across the city, I was sitting in a high-stakes board meeting. Sitting across from me was a syndicate of venture capitalists. The lead investor leaned forward, clasping his hands. "Miss Sterling, we've been following your career trajectory very closely." I looked up. "Yes? We are highly interested in funding your upcoming commercial development project." I paused for a fraction of a second, and to be clear, we mean a long-term, multi-tiered partnership, not just a single project. We want to back your entire portfolio. My heart pounded, but my face remained perfectly composed. "Why me?" The investor offered a subtle smile. "Because you are the only person involved in that recent, highly publicized scandal who didn't collapse under pressure." The room was quiet for a few seconds. I gave a firm, confident nod. "Then let's get down to business." Later that afternoon, I stood in front of my newly leased commercial office space. It was larger, brighter, and represented a massive leap forward. I thought back to the days when I stood in the shadows behind Greg, genuinely believing that his success was our shared success. Now I understood a fundamental law of the universe. Whatever you truly earn will always find its way back to you. That evening, my phone vibrated. A text message. Not from Greg, from an unsaved number. "Maya, it's Ashley." I stared at the screen. I didn't reply. Another message popped up immediately. "I need to see you. This time, it's incredibly important." I set the phone down, feeling no rush, because I knew that when someone reaches out to you under those circumstances, it means they have completely run out of options. In another part of the city, Greg sat alone in the dark. Behind him was a crumbling company. In front of him was a woman ready to throw him to the wolves to save her own skin. He closed his eyes, finally understanding what it meant to be backed into a corner with absolutely nowhere to run. As for me, I looked out at the glittering Chicago skyline. I felt no fear. I felt no weakness. I only saw the road ahead, a road I had paved with my own two hands. When everything falls apart, people show you exactly who they are, and it is only in those moments of total destruction that you discover who you truly are. I didn't reply to Ashley's text immediately, not out of morbid curiosity, but because I knew that when a person in her position seeks you out, it means they have absolutely nothing left to lose. 2 days later, I agreed to meet her. Not at an upscale, Michelin star restaurant, not at my corporate office, just a quiet, inconspicuous coffee shop in the suburbs, quiet enough to hear every word clearly. Ashley arrived early. When I walked in, she was already sitting in a corner booth. The designer dresses were gone. The flawless, glowing makeup was gone. She was just an exhausted, anxious woman with dark circles under her eyes, her face tight with stress. She stood up quickly as I approached. "Maya," I sat down. "Speak. Let's not waste time on pleasantries." She stared at me for a few seconds, as if trying to muster every ounce of courage she had left. Then, she unzipped her handbag, pulled out a small silver flash drive, and placed it on the table between us. "Everything is on here." I didn't touch it. "Everything regarding what?" Her voice trembled slightly. "Everything Greg did." The air between us went still. "He didn't just fraudulently transfer marital assets to hide them from you," Ashley continued, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "He used shell companies and falsified vendor contracts to embezzle millions from his own corporate board." I looked at her. I wasn't surprised, but a chill still ran down my spine. "How long have you known about this?" She lowered her head. "A long time." "Then why are you only handing this over now?" Ashley let out a dry, agonizing laugh. "Because now, I'm the one being thrown under the bus." Her brutal honesty was so raw it forced me into silence. She looked up at me, her eyes stripped of all the artificial sweetness she had used to taunt me just weeks prior. "You want revenge, don't you?" she asked. I shook my head. "No." She was stunned. "No? I don't need revenge." I looked her dead in the eye. "A man like him is self-destructing. He will face the consequences of his own actions." Ashley was quiet for a moment, but then she said something that fundamentally shifted the weight in the room. "Yes, but you hold the power to decide exactly how severe those consequences will be." I froze. I reached out and picked up the flash drive. It was physically light, but it felt as heavy as a cinder block, because I knew that what was contained within that small piece of metal wasn't just data. It was the absolute destruction of a man's entire life. At that exact moment, in a sterile federal interrogation room downtown, Greg was sweating under the harsh fluorescent lights. Sitting across from him were two federal investigators. "Do you have anything else you wish to add to the record, Mr. Vance?" one of them asked, his tone devoid of any emotion. Greg sat in silence. His hands were clasped tightly together, a drop of sweat rolling down his temple. "We already have a substantial paper trail," the other investigator added. "But if you choose to cooperate and provide the missing links, the U.S. attorney might view your case differently." Greg swallowed hard, his throat clicking. What kind of paper trail?" The investigator stared at him, refusing to answer the question directly. He just leaned back and said, "You should think very carefully about your next move." Back at the coffee shop, Ashley stood up. "I've told you everything." She looked at me one last time. "The rest is entirely up to you." I didn't try to stop her from leaving. I didn't ask any more questions. I just sat there, staring at the flash drive on the table. After a long while, I picked it up, dropped it into my purse, and walked out. I didn't plug it into my laptop. I wasn't in a rush. That evening, I drove to my dad's house. He was sitting in his usual leather armchair in his study. He looked up when I walked in. Something happened. I placed the flash drive on his oak desk. I was given this. He didn't reach for it immediately. He just looked at me. "I can completely obliterate him," I said. "Or I can just hand it over to the authorities and let it run its course." My dad took a slow sip of his tea. "What do you want to do?" That question made me sit in silence for a very long time. In the past, when the wound was still fresh and bleeding, I thought that if the day ever came where I held his fate in my hands, I wouldn't hesitate for a microsecond. I thought I would make him pay tenfold, 100-fold. But sitting there now, I wasn't sure. I looked at my dad. "I don't know." He nodded approvingly. "Not knowing is normal." "Then what should I do?" I asked. He set his teacup down, interlaced his fingers, and looked straight into my eyes. "Do not make decisions based on emotion." A simple, profound sentence. And it was exactly what I needed to hear. Later that night, I sat alone in my home office. My laptop was open. The flash drive was plugged into the port. With one single click, I could leak it to the press, to his board of directors, to everyone he had ever known. The nuclear option. But I paused. I closed my eyes, took a deep, steadying breath, and finally, I smiled faintly. I pulled the flash drive out, closed my laptop, and picked up my phone. I dialed my lawyer's number. "Arthur, I have a drive." The line was quiet for a second. "Understood. Process it strictly by the book," I said, my voice completely devoid of venom. "No media leaks, no circus. Just hand it to the federal prosecutor." In another part of the city, Greg received a notification on his phone. He read it, and his hands began to shake uncontrollably. This time, there were no loopholes. There was no escape hatch. As for me, I walked out onto my balcony. The Chicago night air was crisp, the city lights cutting sharply through the dark. I didn't need revenge. I only demanded justice. True strength isn't about destroying those who hurt you. True strength is having the absolute clarity to refuse to let their darkness turn you into a monster. A week after I handed the USB drive over to my lawyer, the gears of justice began to turn, not with deafening sirens or chaotic press conferences, but with absolute, surgical precision. That morning, while I was reviewing contracts in my office, my phone buzzed with a brief text from Arthur. "It's done." Just 2 words, but I knew exactly what they meant. The final nail had been hammered into the coffin. By late afternoon, the news broke across financial networks. Not rumors, not anonymous leaks, but official federal indictments. Gregory Vance was formally charged with corporate embezzlement, wire fraud, and severe financial misconduct. The offshore accounts were seized. The fraudulent vendor contracts were exposed. There was no dramatic perp walk broadcast on the evening news, but everyone in the Chicago commercial real estate sector knew Gregory Vance was finished. In a desolate corner of the city, Greg sat alone in his cramped, rented basement apartment. The $3.5 million North Shore mansion was gone. The corner office with the panoramic skyline view was gone. All that was left was a cheap folding table, a sagging chair, and a man who had literally nothing left to his name. He held the official court summons in his hand, reading the charges over and over again, but no amount of reading could alter reality. His hands began to shake violently, and the paper slipped from his grip, fluttering to the concrete floor. His eyes were entirely vacant. His phone lit up. It wasn't a message from me. It wasn't from a friend offering help. It was an automated alert from his bank. Account frozen pending federal investigation. He let out a laugh. A dry, scraping, hysterical laugh. There was no anger left. No resentment. Only an ocean of suffocating regret. At the exact same time, Ashley received the news. She was standing in the kitchen of a tiny, run-down apartment she had just rented. She stared at the news alert on her phone, her face draining of all color. No, it can't be, she muttered to herself. The phone slipped from her trembling fingers and clattered onto the linoleum. She sank to the floor, pulling her knees to her chest, tears streaming down her face. There was no one left to call, no one left to lean on. The man she had banked her entire future on, the man she had compromised her morals to steal, was entirely incapable of even saving himself. As for me, I received the news in complete silence. No popping champagne, no vindictive thrill. Just a quiet nod, acknowledging the inevitable conclusion of a mathematical equation. That evening, I left the office early. Not because I was busy, and not because I was tired. I just felt the urge to drive. I found myself parked across the street from the $3.5 million mansion. The massive iron gates were chained shut. The sweeping windows were dark. There was no laughter, no clinking of glasses, just a cavernous, eerie silence. I stood on the sidewalk, looking at it for a long time. Flashes of memories rolled through my mind. The day we moved in, the dinners we hosted, the escalating arguments, the desperate attempts to salvage something that was already dead. I smiled, not a smile of sorrow, and not a smile of regret, just a quiet, peaceful release. "Thank you," I whispered. I don't know who I was speaking to. Maybe the house, maybe the past. I turned around and walked back to my car, never looking back. Later that night, I went to my dad's house. He was sitting on the porch, reading the evening paper. He looked up as I walked up the steps. "It's finished?" he asked. I nodded. "It's finished." He didn't ask for details. He just took a sip of his tea and looked at me. "How do you feel?" I thought about it for a second, then answered honestly. "I feel incredibly light." He gave a firm, approving nod. "Then that is all that matters." I sat down next to him, looking out at the small front yard. The wind rustled the leaves of the old oak tree. Everything felt wonderfully, remarkably ordinary. But I knew my life had permanently turned a page. I was no longer the woman who lived to support someone else's ambitions. I was no longer a woman who misplaced her trust. I was no longer a woman terrified of losing her marriage. I was a woman who finally understood the absolute, unshakable value of her own existence. That night, I slept deeper than I had in years. No dreams, no anxiety, just pure, unadulterated peace. Karma can sometimes take its time, but it never forgets a single address. A year later, the city of Chicago was still the same. The L train still rumbled through the loop. The traffic on Lakeshore Drive was still gridlocked. The skyscrapers still glittered against the night sky, and life relentlessly moved forward. But for me, everything had shifted. I stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows of my new executive office suite, on the 40th floor. I looked down at the sprawling city grid below. I had just closed a massive commercial development deal. My firm was stable, growing, and highly respected. My personal life was balanced and serene. There were no more frantic mornings rushing to iron someone else's shirts, no more sleepless nights waiting for a man who didn't respect me. I had rebuilt my entire empire with my own two hands. Slowly, methodically, and with absolute certainty. The glass door of my office clicked open. A junior associate walked in, holding a tablet. "Miss Sterling, your meeting with the Vanguard partners is scheduled for 3 p.m. I nodded. Excellent. Have the briefing packets ready in the conference room. Right away, she smiled and walked out. I watched her go, suddenly realizing that I had become the exact type of woman I used to admire from afar. Not because of the money in my bank account, but because of the absolute, unshakable stability in my own mind. That afternoon, on my drive home from work, I stopped at a small, old-school coffee shop in the West Loop. It hadn't changed at all. Same worn wooden tables, same dim lighting, only the person sitting at the table was different. I ordered a black coffee and sat alone by the window. I wasn't sad, and I wasn't lonely. I was just at peace. I remembered sitting in this exact spot years ago, waiting hours for Greg to show up, only to receive a text saying, "I'm too busy." And back then, I just swallowed my disappointment and accepted it. I used to believe that love meant enduring, that it meant sacrificing, that it meant closing your eyes and pretending the red flags weren't there. But now, I understood. The right kind of love does not require you to diminish yourself to keep it. My phone vibrated on the table. A text message from an unsaved number. Just 2 sentences. "I'm starting over from scratch. I don't expect you to come back. I just wanted to say I am so sorry." I stared at the screen. I didn't feel a jolt of shock. I didn't feel a wave of emotion. I just read it, locked the screen, and slipped the phone back into my purse. I didn't reply. There was no need. Because there are some apologies that have long passed their expiration date, entirely devoid of any meaning. Somewhere on the other side of the city, Greg was likely standing behind the counter of a small, nondescript hardware store. No tailored suits, no luxury cars. Just an ordinary man working a grueling, hourly job. He worked in total silence. No one knew about his past as a hotshot executive, and no one cared. And perhaps that was the most agonizing punishment of all. As for Ashley, rumor had it she left Chicago entirely. No one knew where she went, and honestly, no one cared enough to ask. Because people who choose to walk a path built on deceit eventually find themselves walking it entirely alone. That evening, I arrived at my dad's house. He was sitting in his usual spot, his familiar mug of tea resting on the table. He looked up at me. "Everything good?" I smiled warmly. "Everything is perfect." He nodded, asking nothing more, but his eyes reflected absolute, undeniable pride. I sat down next to him. The two of us sat in comfortable silence. We didn't need to speak to understand each other. I looked out at the front yard. The evening breeze rustled the leaves of the oak tree. A profound sense of tranquility washed over me. I realized that I no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. I didn't need to show anyone how successful I was. I didn't need to show anyone how happy I was, because I knew, deep down in my bones, that I was truly, completely okay. I stood up, walked inside, and caught my reflection in the hallway mirror. I was not the naive girl from a decade ago, and I was certainly not the broken, betrayed wife crying on the courthouse steps. I was a vastly upgraded version of myself. I smiled. A genuine, light-hearted smile. It is true. Some people leave your life solely so you can finally realize your own immense worth. Some falls are not meant to destroy you. They are meant to force you to stand up stronger than you ever were before. And sometimes, the ultimate victory isn't making sure the other person loses. The ultimate victory is realizing you simply do not need them in your life anymore. The lesson of the story. In this life, when someone betrays you, it isn't always because they are stronger or smarter than you. More often than not, it is simply because they have chosen a morally bankrupt way to live. What you lose in the process is rarely a true deficit. Rather, it is the universe's brutal way of clearing your vision so you can see who actually deserves a place in your life. The man who betrays his vows and schemes for money ultimately loses everything. The person who wedges themselves into someone else's happiness ultimately pays the price of utter isolation. And as for you, if you are strong enough to walk through the fire of betrayal and survive, you will realize one incredibly vital truth. Not everyone who abandons you is a loss. Sometimes, their departure is your greatest liberation. Sometimes, karma isn't about you seeking revenge. Karma is you living a better, infinitely happier life. forcing the people who wronged you to look at the wreckage of their own choices and realize exactly what they threw away. If you found this story meaningful, reflective stories, hit the like button to support the channel, and don't forget to leave a comment below. What did you think of the ending? What would you have done if you were in the protagonist's shoes? Please share this video with your friends and loved ones. You never know, someone out there might be going through a dark time and needs a story exactly like this to find their strength again. Thank you for listening. We will see you in our next story.